This is Amalgamations, the Contemporary Jewish Artists podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Klaus. Amalgamations is about, well, the amalgamation of Judaism and the arts, and the people who work and exist in that space. I'm one of those people. I'm Jewish, and I'm a musician. Those two aspects of my identity shouldn't be in conflict, yet I can point to so many examples from my life where they have been. In high school, I was always that kid who had to miss time with my Jewish activities because I had a performance or rehearsal. And in my undergraduate conservatory program, I was a bit of a token Jew. I always questioned why I had to be Jewish at certain times and be a musician at other times. Now, I distinctly remember a time, it must have been the fall of 2009, when I was in the music library at the England Conservatory, where I did my undergrad, and I was thumbing through the section of solo trumpet music looking for repertoire for my upcoming junior recital. I came upon a piece called Proclamation by Ernest Bloch, and I don't know why I gravitated to it, but that moment changed my life. I began to see both parts of me on the page, a beautiful, haunting trumpet melody with these oral references to Bloch's Jewish identity, the augmented thirds, and the shofar calls. Well, I played Proclamation on my recital, and I didn't come back to it until grad school, where I looked at it in depth for my thesis. That process opened up a whole new world to me, where for the first time, I truly felt that I didn't have to leave any part of me at the door, so to speak. A little more than a year later, I had the chance to work at the then-new 6 Points Creative Arts Academy, a Jewish summer camp focused on visual, performing, and creative arts, where I taught instrumental music and did all of the things that make Jewish summer camp. The singing, the prayers, the traditions, and so on. This was yet another time where I could be wholly myself, where I wasn't that weird kid at Jewish camp who played the trumpet in his free time. Being wholly oneself is indescribably empowering, uplifting, and liberating. I live for those moments where all of me comes together physically and or mentally. And that's why I wanted to start this podcast, to be in conversation with other people like me who live at the amalgamation of Judaism and music, or Judaism and theater, or Judaism and dance, or Judaism and painting, or Judaism and whatever creative art speaks to them. One such person is my good friend Ari Sussman, who I had the pleasure of speaking with recently. We met at Havana Shira in 2016.
Yes.
I remember that first time we worked together so vividly. I think it was because anytime you hear a song there in 7/8, it catches your attention. So for the listeners, Havana Shira is a conference that happens at the beginning of every summer for all of the camp song leaders and people who work in similar types of spaces to train, to grow together. And we were both heading off to summers as song leaders at Jewish camp. I was heading to the Kutz camp. You were heading to Ramah, I believe. Mm-hmm. We were putting a group together to lead a session.
We had such a power group we had.
We had a great group. You brought to us this Or Zarua by Nava Tehillah, this amazing singing group from Israel. It was in 7/8. It's just I remember that so vividly. So I'm wondering if you could talk about some of your earliest musical memories and how those memories shaped who you are now.
Sure. So when I was probably around 4 years old, my mother and grandfather, her father, decided to purchase a small little keyboard for me just to kind of play around. And lo and behold, it kind of developed into a musical career. But the specifics are, at least from the stories I'm told, is that like they would have the song playback on the keyboards, and I would just hear it once and immediately be ready to play it back. So I think my mother, from that point on, decided to get lessons for me, and I had that teacher from that point until my junior year of high school. I actually was initially training to be a concert pianist first. I wasn't really thinking about pursuing a career in composition probably until around my junior year. of high school. And before that, I was writing stuff, but I was kind of just writing like fun, campy Jewish songs. I had the great Charles Davidson as my cantor growing up, like when I was young, like pre-bar mitzvah age. So that was certainly, I think, a really important seed in my musical upbringing. And I ultimately decided around my junior year of high school to maybe think about writing something more in the quote concert music. And so I ended up writing a full-on choral piece of the Shir Ladonai, Shir Chadash psalm. And then I started writing non-religious secular concert music. So I wrote a band piece and I wrote a little chamber orchestra piece. And it eventually shifted around for me, shifting from a piano performance angle to a compositional one. And I have never looked back, and I have absolutely no regrets at all.
It's interesting. I'm thinking about this idea of shifts, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate on the shift from composing campy Jewish melodies to composing more, I don't know what you want to, I don't like the word serious, but, maybe explain sort of what do you mean by campy melodies? And I know you grew up at a camp, so maybe talk about your experience growing up at camp, the music you were surrounded by and inspired to write then, and how and why that transitioned to composing music for the concert hall.
Yeah, so I grew up camp-wise at Camp Ramah in the Poconos. Plus, on top of that, I also went to Jewish day school. I remember first going to camp, at least the overnight camp in 2005, and even though I was only, 12 years old or so at the time, I was really able to grasp that music was a really fundamental part of how camp works. And of course, having come in and being somewhat musically inclined, even though I was only 12, it was certainly very clear to me that music was a foundational part of at least Ramon the Poconos, kind of like their philosophy and the foundations as to how they work as a camp. And so hearing just a lot of the songs for the first time then, these were a lot of like really old Israeli classics like Abani B. There's a song called Uvenehem, which is by one of the Banai brothers. I forget which one. And then, of course, getting introduced to Rick Recht and some Dan Nichols and a lot of the kind of the luminaries of the contemporary Jewish camp music scene was kind of really inspiring to me. And I just wrote a lot of songs for that and to do at camp. And some of them kind of, I wouldn't say they blew up per se, but at least like with my ADA, my age group, some of them have kind of stood the test of time. Again, at least only for my age group. And so from there, obviously, I didn't really know significantly much about contemporary classical music at all. All I was really doing is when I was home, I was, intensely studying Bach and playing Beethoven sonatas and trying to learn Chopin preludes and etudes on the piano. And but this was also around the time when YouTube was founded, and a lot of recordings were going up of a lot of composers, or at least who I thought were contemporary. So, the main three that I discovered were Arnold Schoenberg, Steve Reich, and Charles Ives, and they're all incredibly different. I thought they were all contemporary. Little did I know that only one of them was actually alive and still alive at the time. But the change in music, because Arnold Schoenberg and his serialist and second Viennese school of thought, it was just so foreign to me. And I just had no idea how to process that music. And then for someone like Ives, who's kind of in between this second Viennese school sound and philosophy, and then I certainly wouldn't call Ives minimalist, but at least music that seems to have some level of tonal center. It was just really, really interesting thinking and seeing these three people and how they perceived and wrote music. And so that kind of was really helpful for me in trying to figure out what it's like to be a classical composer today. And I've really appreciated that. And I guess I thank YouTube for coming out when it did, or else who knows where I'd be now.
Talk to me about your synagogue growing up, and you talked about the influence of your cantor. How did that influence you, your Jewish identity, your musical identity?
My family and we belonged to Congregation Addis Jeshurun in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania. And it's actually also right down the street from the famous Beth Shalom, the Frank Lloyd Wright synagogue, which he designed and built. So, there's a very incredibly vibrant Jewish community in my town, literally of Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. And I believe there's also a Reconstructionist shul not too far away from town either. So we kind of had the full gamut of everything. And I grew up in the town, just knowing everybody and kind of learning and seeing all the different ways that Judaism can be. And specifically the way that the conservative movement did it, I think had more of a, again, quote unquote, classical focus on music rather than the reform movement. So, of course, the big reform people being like, Dan Nichols and like Debbie Friedman, Jeff Klepper, where in the conservative movement was kind of more focused on Lewandowski and Max Janowski and those guys. And so my synagogue growing up, especially on high holidays, which was just this incredible musical experience of organ and chorus. So kind of watching and hearing this music, I didn't realize how powerful it could be. And I didn't realize how many different modes in regards to like musical modes that existed. And I didn't really learn about the three main Jewish modes until later. But hearing the so-called Fragish sound of that augmented second that is often affiliated with klezmer, but then hearing like that Adonai Malach really strong Mixolydian flat seven mode, which just has so much power behind it, especially in the Max Janowski music, like Avinu Malkeinu and Sim Shalom especially. So growing up with that and just hearing that immense power, especially on the high holidays, I think was certainly influential really early on for me.
So to tie it all together, this is what's so fascinating and wonderful about you, is I get the sense that there's all these different parts of your Jewish being, your musical being, that are coming together from all these different parts of your life. You've talked about camp, a certain type of singing there, and a certain type of music there. You've talked about the synagogue, to a certain extent, your day school, and then you also had your secular music. I am just so fascinated to hear more about how it all kind of came together. So let's talk about how the musician side of you and the Jewish side of you came together. And so I'm wondering, I guess I'll start by asking, as you became more serious about piano and composing, and about your Jewish involvement, were there ever any times when those parts of you felt in conflict?
Yeah, to a degree. So when I was, like early high school, I'll say ninth, 10th grade or so, and I was like really, really deep into the piano thing. And like, it wasn't even a question in my mind that at a bare minimum, I was going to be studying music, but specifically piano performance. I was like, this is definitely the path I'm going on. At this point, I'm playing a lot of recitals in the Philly area, and I was up to play some Mozart piano concertos with a few local orchestras. Certainly not Philadelphia Orchestra, but like local community orchestra.
Maybe someday.
Who knows? Um, and there was a point where I was just, even like every kid, and quite frankly, most pianists, the practicing all day and all the time was just getting really exhausting, and especially for learning concertos, because you spend 6 months bare minimum every day of your life working to memorize a piece you're going to play a total of 1 to 3 times.
Hmm.
And I wasn't finding that fulfilling at all. Like at first I was, and then it was kind of just like, I don't think this is what I want to be doing. And so I think just kind of, as you mentioned, where I mean, growing up, especially early on, musically, I was a sponge. I was just trying to take in everything I could, just because resources were not super heavy for me, and all my piano teachers didn't know a lot about contemporary classical music. The furthest they were going historically might have been like Shostakovich if they were showing me any music, and that's pretty much as World War II and earlier. So anything beyond World War II, I wasn't really aware of until the aforementioned three. Nevertheless, I was trying to think, what is another option for me musically in which I can feel really artistically fulfilled, but not have to slave away at a piano and making sure my fingerings are perfect and making sure my articulations are perfect and not speeding up due to performance anxiety and nerves. And it was really tough for me. And so there was kind of this like little intermediary period of like, what do I want to do? That didn't mean I stopped writing or stopped playing. It was just, I think, it was kind of the start of the shift.
When was that?
Probably somewhere between 10th and 11th grade, where I was really like beginning to focus on that shift.
I really identify with that from a sort of different perspective. And I hope this story doesn't sound trite, but I remember summers at Eisner Camp, which was a Jewish camp that I worked at. And I was kind of that weird kid who brought his trumpet and was
Yep.
practicing on my hour off.
Yeah,
And
I would bring all my scale and arpeggio books to camp with me, and the pianos at Ramah were not great.
I can only imagine.
Yeah, there was maybe one that was serviceable, and so I would try to spend my free time. Not that a 14-year-old, 15, 16-year-old camper has a lot of that, but I don't necessarily have a lot of permission to do that because, of course, the counselors and the staff need to make sure that you are supervised, or at least they know where you are at all times. So, of course, it was difficult for me to ask my counselors as a 15-year-old. I could easily run away, but I just needed to go practice. So that was really hard to do, and that was tough. And there were a lot of things in my life, multiple Israel trips in which I had to either postpone or just not go on altogether, because I needed to stay home and practice and work. But nevertheless, the path has been writing itself.
What I hear in your music is those parts of you coming together. I don't know if that's my interpretation or if you put any stock in that, but to me, it's just inspiring to hear these different conflicts sort of resolving themselves in your music. I don't know. Does that resonate with you at all?
Yes and no. So yes, because I am a firm believer in that one's upbringing, adolescence, childhood is a crucially foundational part of who one becomes later in life. But then no, because I believe that individually as humans, we're constantly evolving and changing and developing new philosophies and ideals within our lives.
Was there a point where you realized that you could bridge the gap between your Jewish self and your musical or secular self, or did it sort of happen gradually?
Yeah, so the two have kind of always been morphed. It's really difficult for me to, remove an identity which I am proud of from the music that I write. And I think you can say that really about a lot of people in regards to however they identify, whether, sexual orientation or gender or race or ethnicity, religion. I think it's kind of really hard to separate those things from when you write music.
So it's not as if the your Jewish identity and your non-Jewish identity merged together. For you, it was always these sort of parallel paths. It sounds like.
Let me put it this way. If I have a container of, say, like water and oil, the two are never going to mix together, but they're still in the bowl together.
And that's an analogy for your Judaism and your music.
Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're separated, because they're still certainly, again, like the water and the oil are still in the bowl together. But that hasn't necessarily made me become someone like a Janowski or a Lewandowski or a Sulzer or something. That's not where I want my full identity to be, like a composer of Jewish music. I do want that to be a part of my identity, but I don't want it to fully encapsulate my identity.
Yeah, I think you said that really well. And it's interesting always to me how Jewish composers throughout history have had to be pigeonholed either as Jewish composers or as Jews who write music.
And we face a similar crisis now with gender. where a lot of composers that identify as female are, being labeled as women composers as opposed to just composers. And so I think the struggle kind of lives on for anyone that has a particular marginalizing identity. And I think we're starting to see that curve going up, in which where we're able to kind of shed any identifying labels and you can just be a composer. And I think any facet or element of your identity, if you choose to make it and allow it to be a part of your music, that's totally up to the individual composer. But again, I think it's really important to be able to share facets of my identity in as many ways as I can.
I love that oil and water in a bottle analogy. What is the experience like for you as a classical musician being in Jewish camp like musical spaces? And as a corollary, how do you, Ari, bridge the gap between the experience of music as passionate communal prayer and music as an experience to evoke emotion through listening?
I can play music in a major key, and this can uplift 400 campers and another 150 staff. Whereas, in classical music, it's an entirely different thing, where a lot of the meanings are completely hidden. They're very subtle. They're not on the surface, and it's a whole different way of trying to thinking and reap the emotions that come with that specific music. So they're certainly very, very different. And I really do appreciate the differences in the two and the fact that both have a significant and integral part of my heart and my musical being.
Ari's compositions have a multitude of extra musical influences, from Kabbalah to the natural world to poetry. You're listening to Kol Galgal as performed by the New England Conservatory Philharmonia, which Ari wrote in 2017. Kol Galgal, which translates to Voice of the Wheel, is based on text from the Zohar. When did you become interested in Kabbalah? And tell me a little more why those texts resonate with you.
Sure. So I think it's also worth noting that, around the time I was born, a little beforehand, my mother was very intensely studying Kabbalah, which is why I'm named Ari, because there's the Rabbi Isaac Luria who was named Ha'ari. And she really liked his words and teachings and decided to name me, my first name at least, after him. So I think in like this weird, twisted way, it's kind of always been a part of me. But then over the last few years, as I've kind of been like reevaluating my religious life and kind of unaffiliating with the conservative movement of Judaism, I'm kind of reaffiliating with, not reaffiliating, but more affiliating with the renewal movement of Judaism, which, has a lot of ties with being Jewish in the natural world. And of course, the renewal movement has a very strong emphasis on learning Kabbalah and some of these texts. And so when I first discovered the Kol Galgal texts, it just blew my mind that the imagery of the sounds of our natural world and our existence in the natural world is reminiscent of a wheel on a chariot, that it just constantly keeps on moving, and that our physical and spiritual embodiments, even when we leave the physical world, will continue to move on. And it kind of reminds me of like this, quasi Hindu Buddhist thought of like reincarnation. And I just absolutely love that thought process. And so when I started writing the music to Kol Galgal, it really gave me just like a lot of musical opportunity. Steve Reich is an influence of mine on many levels because, one, he's Jewish and has written a lot of liturgically based music, but it's also on the idea of finding this music that can be hyper repetitive and hypnotic to accomplish this idea of a world in a constant perpetual motion.
There was a moment in the piece that for me was the most riveting. It's the moment about halfway through when there's this big orchestral crescendo to a one chord, and then it suddenly dies away to nothing.
It's not necessarily about that moment per se, but kind of more the sections in which they belong. So this big boom that you're talking about, the piece just kind of comes to a screeching halt, kind of just like allows all the music previous to culminate to this moment. But then it kind of just moves to this idea of like the spiritual realm rather than the physical realm.
Let's talk a little bit about Needless to Say. And I want to read out, there's I don't know if a poem, a sentence, I don't know what you would even call it.
That haiku. So.
It's a haiku. Oh, of course. Let the mind's ear stray, tremor's realm, needless to say, don't say anything. Did you write that?
I did.
I love it. Now, I'm listening to this piece, and it's this, really incredible string quartet, again, in two sections, right? And I'm thinking there doesn't seem to be a Jewish connection in this piece. Is there one?
On the surface, no. It's just really a piece written by a living composer for string quartet. But I think a lot of the reasons why I wrote it, why the text exists, why the music exists compared to the text, I think comes from Jewish upbringing and teaching. So I conceived of this piece around November of 2016, if you're catching my drift. And it was a kind of this idea of thinking that rhetoric can be so influential on people, and how the idea of speech specifically can be life-changing in many different ways. So the way that the music was developed is using this concept of aleatory, meaning giving freedom to the players. So I give them a certain set of guidelines notationally, and they are allowed to do whatever they want, which is why the music kind of sounds so sporadic. And what the music emulates to me is a conversation that turns into an argument, which is also kind of like the crucial point before it also, like the orchestra piece, goes to kind of a more drony a more drony section. So the first half, it's kind of just people at peace talking, discussing whatever, and then just gradually intensifies and intensifies until it just literally there's no more room for anything but just utter screaming at each other. The second half of the piece is more kind of dwelling on what could be and how we can reconcile differences. And these differences can be so many different ones. And I think it's just important for people to be able to live together regardless of difference. And I think we're at a point right now where it is a very far cry. And so I think that this piece is kind of reminding me that it's possible, and while a far cry, maybe at some point we'll get there.
You've been listening to Needless to Say, as performed by the new Fromm Chamber Players at the Tangoing Music Center in 2019. The first half, it seems to sort of wander and then stop and then wander again a few times over. I almost hear this idea of like straying, right? But juxtaposed with these, when it stops, it's almost a reminder to not say anything.
Yeah, so it's that for sure, but it's also, especially there's a few moments of silence in the first section, and so which I think is what you're alluding to.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
reason they're there is also just like, don't you ever wonder, like, if you ever get into an argument or a loud conversation or you're just around a lot of sound, you just need a break. And
Yeah.
so that's kind of what these are. So the first one, there's two in that first section. The first one kind of is succeeded by, relatively calm music. It's still conversational. But then the second one, it ends super abruptly and then begins again super abruptly into just the absolute chaotic, hysterical madness. And I think it's something that we've all dealt with. We've all been in an argument at some point. We've all been really sick of being in an argument at some point and just need that break. And so it's kind of what that is there for. And yes, it's a reminder, as you said, of don't say anything. So
Now, I want to dive a little deeper into this idea of the Jewish connection or not Jewish connection. And what I think you alluded to earlier was this idea that your Jewish upbringing, your Jewish values, have this influence in these deep ways on the way that you think. But you're very specific about it, right? You're not this sort of nebulous idea of, I'm a Jewish composer, so somehow my Judaism is going to seep into my music. I don't hear that from you. And it harkens back to our original conversation about, not being pigeonholed as a Jewish composer and, marginalized identities, that type of thing. So that is a great segue into a piece of yours that I wanted to talk about, your piece, We Are. And I think that the connection you drew there between aleatoric music, where music is left to chance, and the idea that you, as the composer, cannot specify everything, and not even the performer can, that using that concept to say that we are is for all that cannot be, or for all who cannot be, and that therefore we need to step up for those who don't have a voice. That idea I just found to be simply ingenious, and you use it as a metaphor, or I guess rather as a call to action for gun violence prevention. In fact, with the piece, you recommend several specific actions that we can take to make a difference. Could you maybe talk more on how your Jewish upbringing and influenced you on this and other issues of social justice? Are there other ways that your Jewish upbringing really specifically influenced your music?
So I think I should preface all of it by just saying how the piece We Are came to be. So a pianist friend of mine named Leor Willinger, who's doing his doctorate in piano at the Peabody Institute in Baltimore. He's an outstanding musician and also he's using music as a call to action. He's done so much work musically by finding ways to make some type of change, a necessary change. He approached me, I think, in the summer of 2017, I want to say, and he told me that he's asking 10 composers to write pieces for him about a social justice issue of their choice. And so a lot of the composers that were commissioned for this project wrote pieces that were hyper specific to their identities and how a lot of the topics that they spoke about and wrote pieces about were just so poignant and so moving. So many pieces. And so I chose to do gun control partially on a basis because we've gone through so many of these just horrific atrocities in which they could have been prevented so long ago, and we haven't done it yet. I don't understand how we go through Stoneman Douglas, Orlando, and Dayton, and Las Vegas, and San Bernardino, and the other hundreds of mass shootings that have happened, and we've literally made like 2% progress
If that.
since Columbine. While I was writing the piece, and this is where I've been thanking Leor a lot because it made me want to call my Congress people more on both sides of the aisle. It made me want to donate money. And so I donated money to Ceasefire PA. It's an organization that helps promote for gun control reform, specifically in Pennsylvania. And it's actually run by one of my old campers' mothers who actually ran for Congress in the last election.
Now, I can only imagine that your Jewish upbringing had to have something to do with that.
Oh, of course. I mean, if there's one thing that I've taken away from the thousands of dollars my parents spent on my education, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. And I know it's a very generic teaching, but it's an important one because, just the basic idea of being able to just love people. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean, like parental love. It's just caring for people. And, there's so many ways that I've seen negligence by people against other people, and it saddens me.
You've been listening to We Are, as performed by the composer at the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance, Mackintosh Theater in 2018. So we talked about these pieces of yours that maybe are not specifically Jewish, but I'd love to sort of close out by talking about Higale Na. So the first 3 minutes of Higale Na has the choir repeating the words Higale Na in a chant-like minimalistic way that crescendos to an almost shout of the words. So these words, Higale Na, are from Yedi Nefesh, this piyut, this liturgical poem that's beautiful. It's from the fourth stanza, and it means reveal yourself. I was so struck by the repetition and the almost shouting of these words. What do these words mean to you?
The first time I really thought about this text and what it means was actually at Havana Shira. And I remember Shira Klein shared this really lovely Higale Na. I don't know if she wrote it, but at a bare minimum, shared it with the Kahal when we were there. And she just gave a really beautiful kind of like dvar or a drash on just the words alone, Higale Na. And I was so struck by the imagery that she brought up. This piece to me, I think, is actually my most poignant and the one that has really resonated with me the most, because the text of Yedi Nefesh is just so beautiful. And so I think when I was thinking about this idea of reveal yourself, I think it was kind of like a big call for me, partially because I was on the verge of coming out as bisexual at the time. It kind of helped me find some level of confidence in myself to be able to share that with everyone in my life. And so, obviously, just the idea of reveal yourself certainly, I think, encapsulates that idea. But I think musically was also important for me because it helped me develop the style of musical aleatory in which I give the performer something to do, but I leave a lot of it up to them. And on top of that, everything also being timed. So the music feels as if it's kind of just like suspended in air. And that's a really important quality for me to have musically. And so that's kind of how the Higale Na text becomes so strong, despite it just being 2 words.
Now, from there, the text continues on the solo soprano voice while the choir sings the words Higale Na in a frantic, almost whisper. Actually, by the end, I believe they are whispering. So the words of the Higale Na stanza seem to almost fade into a sea of nothingness. What's the significance of that?
It comes from the last words of the entire poem slash that stanza or vechoneni kimei olam. And I was really struck with the last word, olam, and how the Aramaic equivalent, which we can hear in Kaddish, is almaya. I kept olam and then I added almaya. And so the end of the piece becomes this gradual shift from the choir singing these higalena fragments, these like very sporadic, almost electronic sounding fragments. And then it kind of moves into this like really like raspy whisper of the word almaya. And I actually, if people want to kind of like a sonic visual, even though that doesn't work, but you get what I mean. In my performance note, I said, make this sound as if you are Harry Potter speaking parcel tongue. And of course, everyone in the choir, they all knew exactly the sound what I was looking for. And I wanted like this, like I belong in Slytherin house sound. And so, yeah, it was just kind of taking this idea of eternity and just trying to fathom that. And so I think the sound what I was looking for was an attempt to try to fathom the subject matters of revealing yourself, but then the last word of that being eternity. Just trying to figure that out and just trying to fathom it, in which I knew, even writing it, that it's impossible to fathom what eternity is, but I could at least attempt to fathom what eternity is.
You've been listening to Higale Na as performed by the University of Michigan Chamber Choir at Hill Auditorium in 2019. So I want to preface this question in a certain way, and I'll say this: lest the listener think that Ari is just a Jewish composer, there are many, and I would guess actually more of Ari's works that are not specifically Jewish. Is that a fair assumption?
That is a very fair assumption.
So my question is this: who are you? What is your identity?
Yeah, it's a great question. I suppose, like, me as a person is various intersecting identity points for me. Include that I'm proud to be Jewish. I'm proud to be a member of the queer community, and that took me a long time to come to terms with. And now I feel nothing but pride for that. I am someone that really loves sports as well. A lot of like my close friends know this, but I actually play a lot of basketball. My life is bizarre being a queer Jewish basketball playing, banjo playing composer. I think it makes me incredibly unique, but and I think it's really difficult to stand out these days. So just anything I suppose I can do to help facilitate that. But it's certainly neat to have all of these things about my life that are very important to me and who I am.
I think that's a great answer. And it speaks to the type of people and ideas that I want to lift up in this podcast. This idea of your intersecting identities and where your Judaism comes into play with that. It's something I've struggled with my whole life in my own way. And so I thank you for sharing about that. My last question is, and again, I'll leave it very open-ended. What's next?
Since I just became a doctoral candidate the other day, I kind of have a lot of free time at the moment. So
Congratulations on that, by the way.
thank you, thank you. I can now begin working on my dissertation. So I'm planning on writing a piece that actually combines classical music elements with like folk and traditional music elements. I think it'll be a really nice way to kind of culminate my music within an academic environment. Before that, though, I have a piece being played in Carnegie Hall in November, and that's on commission, so I have to work on that over the summer. And that's going to be just like a relatively short orchestra piece. And then before that, I'm kind of going to write this super quickly. Two violinist friends of mine, they want me to write a violin duo for them. So I need to work on that. And I've had like my head has been bursting with ideas for really all three of these pieces. So I'm really excited to get to work on that. And that is essentially literally those three pieces of music are quite literally my entire life until this point next year.
That's great. Well, I'm a fan, and I speak for hopefully many of the listeners who say that I'm can't wait to hear what comes out of it. And Ari, I cannot thank you enough for your time today. It's been just so fascinating getting to hear your stories and your ideas, and really uplifting for me, and how it resonates with who I am. So thank you so much. If you'd like to learn more about Ari and listen to more of his music, visit him online at arisussman.com, arisussman.com. Thanks so much for listening. Our theme song is F Minor Klezmer by the Orchestra from their album Fancy Cocktails and Hot Sauce. Check them out at the_orchestra.com. That's orchestra with a K, ORKESTRA. I'm your host, Aaron Klaus, and this has been Amalgamations, the Contemporary Jewish Artists Podcast.